see. Yeah, get the panel too, you know? Trump. Hello? Hello? So it's my pleasure to be here today. I want to thank Mary for organizing the event, doing such a terrific job. My approach in this has always been a big tent approach, and so there's certain regionalisms that you have throughout the country. So for someone like me from the West, it could be the Devil's Rock is my Empire State Building. And so there are different points of view. A lot of the discussion we've talked about has to do with kind of project photography, documentary photography, which is an important element, but not the entirety of photography. How do you deal with things that might be art or part of a historic art movement? How do you deal with other issues? And how do you deal with things that aren't based in New York City? So these are all areas of great interest to me, and the panel we have here are institutions that have three of the great photography collections in their institutions. At Duke, they've been actively collecting documentary photography for decades and have set up, in many ways, one of the great programs in the country, but perhaps not as well publicized as some of the others. The Huntington Library has one of the great historic collections of American photography. Scads of Edward Weston and Carlton Watkins and things, so that their original founder, Henry Huntington, was one of the avid collectors of photography at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. Their interest is continuing as we move into the 21st century. Jenny Watts has been a curator there for 30 years, I suspect. 25? Only 25. And her interest in photography is vast. And her ability to deal with it is wonderful. George Miles is at the Beinecke Library. The Beinecke has one of the great collections of photography as well. And George has been building the collection for many decades now. So one of the areas we touched on briefly yesterday was the idea of matchmaking. How do you match up your photographs with institutions? What are they looking for? How do they define in their terminology, what they might be defining as their subject matter may be a different way than you describe your work. So with that, let me just turn the panel over to Jenny.
Thank you, Andy. And can you hear me well enough? And thank you to all of you for being here. You're way ahead of the curve from what we're doing on the West Coast in terms of having a group like this. I'm very envious, and Mary, you're to be commended for thinking ahead and getting this group going. And I'm also really grateful, even though Nils, is he here still? Yes, that was the one that got away. I'm sorry I didn't know about the Morgan Archive. But I'm so grateful that it's at UCLA, and I think it's a really fantastic acquisition for that organization, and I think we'll all be the beneficiaries of that. So thank you for doing a nice setup for us. So I want to just speak very briefly. You can see here the Huntington Library Art Collections and Botanical Gardens in 10 minutes, a history in 10 minutes. And the reason I want to do this is because I realize that even though I've been doing this for 25, not 30 years, that people still don't think about the institution as one that collects photography, but we have since the very beginning. And a lot of people only think about the Huntington in terms of books and in terms of the botanical gardens. So let me just give you a little nuts and bolts here. The story starts with one of the industrialists of the Gilded Age, Collis Huntington, who you see on your right, along with Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller in the middle. Collis Huntington was a robber baron who built the western side of the Transcontinental Railway, and in the main, basically amassed a gigantic fortune. Collis had a favorite nephew named Henry. Henry was also a businessman, helped Collis with his railroad enterprises. And upon Collis's death, Henry got half the fortune. But Henry was a very savvy businessman himself, and so several years later, he married Collis's widow, Arabella, thus consolidating the fortune. The guy knew what he was doing. Apparently, it was a love match, but still. Henry loved Southern California, and he and Arabella, with their vast sums of money, moved there and built this beautiful Beaux-Arts mansion, which is now one of our galleries, and set it in the middle of a many hundreds of acre working ranch, then a working ranch. He then went on to, and this is the interior of that space, which is where they lived, which is now, as I said, one of our galleries. He then went on to develop the grounds, and now it's 207 acres of botanical specimens. We've got many different kinds of gardens, and Huntington was a collector, and he was a collector of plants, as well as paintings. Under Arabella's influence, he also started collecting 18th and 19th century British art, decorative arts, and sculpture. And you see here one of our portrait galleries. There you see at the very end of the gallery our iconic work known as Blue Boy, painted by Thomas Gainsborough. But Huntington was first and foremost a bookman, and he built this library in 1910. And during his lifetime, he had such a great fortune that he was able to go to auction and purchase entire libraries en bloc. So he would go into an auction house and just purchase the entire contents of a catalog. So what did that mean? Well, I thought that was very nice how Mary set up this morning, because for those of you who know the history of photography, some of the great photography collections in the country come from libraries. Why? Well, because photos appeared in books primarily as original artifacts in books. That's why the New York Public Library has such a great collection. That's why the Huntington has such a great collection. But it wasn't necessarily acknowledged as such until many, many decades later. The Huntington's collections now, or collecting areas within the library, this is our main exhibition hall, contains 9 million items, ranging from rare books to manuscripts to 1 million photographs, actually. This is one of our reading rooms. We have several. We have 1,700 scholars that come from around the world every year, and we give $1.7 million in grant funding for those scholars to come and do research in the collections. That's one of our most robust aspects of the institution. And so this really is a research institution. It's a research collection. That's our raison d'etre. That's how we view ourselves. But, and I should say, and this gets back to this idea of collecting, Huntington himself was not particularly interested in photography, only so far as it sort of supported his own interests. So of the 1 million photographs in our collection, we have some areas of great strength, such as the American Civil War, for instance, which was Huntington's interest, or the Native Americans of the Southwest. But starting at Huntington's death in 1927 and moving forward, we concentrated almost exclusively on California and the American West as our area of interest and strength. And that is really the bulk of our collection, is California and the American West, west of the Mississippi. So here's one of our treasures, Carlton Watkins' photograph. In 1937, Edward Weston printed 500 prints for the Huntington as part of his Guggenheim grant. So we got 500 prints from Weston himself in 1937. Why? Well, because there weren't a lot of places that were actually collecting photography. And as Mary's pointed out early on, which I think this is a great story, when Weston approached the Huntington to do this, the Huntington said, okay, but we'll pay for materials, but not your time. This is in 1937, so he printed us 500 prints for $1.50 a piece for materials. And the Huntington also said at the time, we're not interested in your nudes. We just want things to document the landscape. So thankfully, Weston threw in a few other things like shells and whatnot as part of the deal. But we do continue collecting photography up to the present with things like this beautiful Karen Halverson panorama of Mulholland Drive. So we're actively collecting. And we several years ago, began a very ambitious exhibition program in our gallery spaces. This is an exhibit I curated, I think in 2001 or 2 on panoramic photography. This was one we were able to do in 2008, 150 years of Los Angeles photography. And what was wonderful about being able to curate an exhibit like this is really we could do almost everything out of the collection. We did have some loans in here, but it was from the beginning of photography in Los Angeles to the present at that time. And we're also doing a lot more now with online exhibitions. So this is, again, speaks to this idea of what historic value do your collections have. We got an 80,000 item archive from the Corporate Archive of Southern California Edison. Why were they documenting their operations? Well, they were just interested in liability and all sorts of things. But really what we've discovered is really better living through electricity if you get to the bottom of it. So we invited about 10 to 12 different types of sort of interested parties, everything from artists like Kathy Opie and Mark Klett to writers, curators, thinkers, to curate little online exhibitions out of the archive, which we called Form and Landscape, and you can see the different kinds of topics that they came up with. It was really, really a fantastic thing. Some of the publications we've been able to do over the years, everything from monographic, you see Maynard Parker up there on the left, I call him the unknown Julius Schulman, to Edward Weston, and then some more thematic shows like the Los Angeles and the Civil War. So I'll just end you with this image from the Edison archive and invite you all to come out when you can. I think I'll leave you with 3 comments before I turn this over to my colleagues. I think we've had an extraordinary amount of information the last 2 days. But just a couple of things I'd like to reiterate from an institutional perspective, which I think, again, was very well set up here. I think it's always good to come to an institution like the Huntington or any of the other institutions represented here to have a clear sense of the institution's mandate and kind of purview and what they're about. So do a little due diligence ahead of time. And that can just be, frankly, from the website as a first off, but then just sort of talking to people in the field, talking to other people you know, other artists who've placed their institutional archives and whatnot, and just get a sense of who are the players and how do institutions operate is a good one. I think it's also important to know what you want. I think Nils was very good about listing that at the beginning. Know what you want and remain open and flexible with that, because we really are inundated. I kind of view this as sort of in a way, kind of a crisis moment. We're being inundated by what I'm kind of referring to now as the end of the analog generation. So it's, I think, a really exciting time, but a little bit of a daunting time if you're sitting in an institution, because we're getting a lot of people coming to us very, very frequently. And it ranges from people sort of cold calling who really don't have the vaguest idea what they have, to people who are very, very organized and have lists and have a very strong sense. And you can imagine which ones we respond to more readily. I also think just my final comment will be, and I'm sure my colleagues will reiterate this, be clear about, sometimes it's not, I think people don't quite understand the investment the institution is making as well, not just in terms of monetary cost, but I take my position very seriously in the sense that even if it's a straight donation, it has to not only fit to our collecting policies and our strengths, but I really have to try and look into the future, not only in terms of what we can handle as an institution, how quickly things can be made accessible, but I'm also trying to think about sort of what as much as any of us can do this, what future generations are going to value and look for in an archive. And so I think also the other final thing is just realize when something comes into us, someone, I think Nils pointed this out actually, be realistic in terms of what you think an institution can do in terms of getting the material out there. I mean, realistically, we're talking about several years, not several weeks or months. So this is an ongoing process, and we like to partner with people and really help to make this happen. No really conscientious archivist takes on an archive that they think during their lifetime or their career can't get managed, I think. That's sort of how we are responding to it now. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleagues.
That's great, thank you. Can you all hear me? Is that good? Great. I'm Lisa McCarty. I'm curator of the Archive of Documentary Arts, which is part of the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke University. And can I control the slides from here? Let me see if I can. Okay, great. As Andy mentioned, we are quite proud of our collections, and we've been collecting documentary arts of all kinds for over 20 years. But I think we are maybe the lesser-known institution on the map, whether that's for geographic reasons. I don't know how many people have visited Durham, North Carolina. I can attest that it's a great place, and it's definitely a center for activity for the documentary endeavor, which I'm happy to talk about more broadly in the Q&A what might be considered documentary, but that's actually a whole nother conference in and of itself. So, but I'm very interested in kind of broadening our definition, as well as deepening our collections of maybe more traditional documentary work as well. But the Archive of Documentary Art, so it's part of the Special Collections Library at Duke. So what that means is that we're the non-circulating collection, so most of our materials are held off-site. You have to make an appointment to come and view materials, but that doesn't mean you have to be a Duke student or faculty member. Anyone can come, the general public can come. You don't even have to have a library card. And if you, for some reason, walked into our doors but didn't know we didn't have those materials on site, we would assist you and kind of orient you to the catalog and help you find the things that you need. We just might not have them that day. I have our mission statement up here. Our mission is to collect, promote, preserve, and provide access to audio, moving images, photography, and text from around the world related to the documentary endeavor for the purpose of inspiring reflection, research, creative expression, and dialogue in this moment and for generations to come. So we're definitely thinking on a long historical timeline and about lots of different kinds of uses for the materials. So our history. The Archive of Documentary Arts was initiated within the Rubenstein Library in partnership with the Center for Documentary Studies, which I feel like some of you may know more so than the library. The Center for Documentary Studies was founded a year before the ADA was established, and it at first was a repository to collect work coming out of the center, either by faculty or visiting artists, and we also have student collections. So in some great cases, we've collected work from students as undergrads that have gone on to have great careers, but it's also a record of the teaching of some of the individual artists whose archives we hold. And the first big acquisition in our area was the photographs and papers of Paul Kowalski. And that was a pretty vast collection, and that's not to say that the Rubenstein Library wasn't already collecting photography prior to that. The library, the Special Collections Library, has been at Duke since the 1920s, and we have some great early examples of, we have a Julia Margaret Cameron portfolio, we have a lot of representation of the Civil War, your Gardners, your Bradys, your Barnards. So we have an encyclopedic collection, but this commitment to contemporary photography collecting happened more recently. And so the Koleski collection, as well as the William Gedney Archive, which came to us in 1992, basically strengthened our commitment to collecting not only individual folios and rare books with photographs, but to entire archives by modern photographers. And so that includes, in some cases, finished prints, but contact sheets, work prints, journals, ephemera, all the records of the creative process, which we think is really valuable from a research perspective. So you don't only see the prints that William Gedney was most interested in, you see how he got to that point. And in the case of Gedney, he was also a prolific writer, so you can actually read his journals and his handwriting and see what he was thinking about while he was working in Eastern Kentucky, for example. And that's not to say we only collect full archives, we also collect portfolios, photo books, audio recordings and oral histories, moving images, and vernacular image collections. To talk a little bit more about the collections, the Rubenstein Library overall holds more than 350,000 rare books and 10,000 manuscript collections. And also to put that in perspective, the Archive of Documentary Arts is just one of 7 specialized collection areas in the library. So I have 6 other colleagues that are focused on different subject areas and sometimes also collecting photography, sometimes collecting many different things. So I focus specifically on documentary arts, but I have colleagues focusing on the history of medicine, women's history and culture, African American history and culture, the history of advertising, and there's a human rights archive as well. We also have a curator dedicated to our literature collections. So the work in the ADA is just one area of the library, and there's over 500 individual documentarians resides in the Archive of Documentary Arts, as well as the work of makers that have been associated with the Center for Documentary Studies, which we have their institutional records as well, and the Full Frame Documentary Film Festival, which also originated with the Center for Doc Studies. Our collection formats, again, cover the history of photography, filmmaking, and audio recording. So we have examples of all formats, from daguerreotypes to inkjet prints, and actually we just acquired some raw files from a photographer for the first time, which was pretty exciting. We have examples from 35 millimeter nitrate film to digital video, and again, from wax cylinders to WAV files. Just a few collection highlights. I just wanted to mention some of the larger archives that we have, but I encourage you to visit the ADA website, which is both in the program for today, and I think Mary will make available. But I have a collections page which outlines almost every single photographer that's represented in the collection, which you can browse, and you can browse by individual maker, or by medium, or by subject matter. So I'd encourage you, if you're more curious about what collections we have, it's all on the website. Just do some digging and you can see the other types of work we have. Some more contemporary work. Alex Harris and Tom Rankin are faculty members at the Center for Documentary Studies, but we've also collected more recent work by Sarah Hoskins and Lynn Seville, and that's again, just to name a few. Public programs and activities. So like my colleagues, my job is somewhat multifaceted, that while I am charged with acquiring work and bringing work to the collection, my job is just as much about awareness. So getting researchers, scholars associated with Duke and not to know about what we have and to come use it, and then to make the Duke community aware of what we have. And sometimes that's through teaching. Sometimes that's through individual class visits, so like having an art history class, or in some cases, even outside of the humanities, like a science class coming to look at early medical photographs, for example. So doing class visits, sometimes teaching classes from the archive, full semester-long classes, and doing individual research assistance. So if we have scholars coming from out of town, or just people that appear at our door, if they're not sure what they're looking for, we assist them and try to direct them to those resources. We also host a visiting, visiting artist and filmmaker program. The visiting artist is actually a new program where we invite an artist to come biannually to do a residency, to stay at Duke for about 4 weeks, and to initiate a research project that they propose and essentially integrate work from our collections in a new work of art, and then we'll add their new work of art to the collection. And we also host exhibitions of our collection material in the library. This is a picture of our new exhibition space. So the Rubenstein Library has been under renovation for the last 2 years, and we just moved into this new space, which has 4 gallery spaces, but this one in particular is dedicated just to photography and primarily from the Archive of Documentary Arts. You'll also see the kind of window there. That actually looks into the reading room. So again, kind of driving home the connection between what's on the wall and what's available in the reading room. So if you want to see, this is an exhibit of work by Sidney Gamble. So if you wanted to see more work by Sidney Gamble, for example, you can just go right into the reading room, which is around the corner, and see more work by him. ADA collection services. So I just wanted to mention, those were kind of the public-facing outreach activities that I engage in. But every collection that comes in, gets treated equally. And I just kind of wanted to mention the things that we provide to collection material when we do accept it. So perpetual care, a term we like to use, perpetual care of collection materials. And that can include physical organization and rehousing, cataloging, preservation, and in some cases, digitization. Although our digitization program is just a small slice of what we have. We can't begin to digitize every single image that comes into the collection, of course, but we've initiated a couple different projects. For example, the William Gedney Archive we're engaged in a project now to digitize, actually in that case, almost every item in that collection. So since it's one of our most popular collections, you wouldn't necessarily, although I highly recommend coming in person to look at the prints, but I don't have to sell that to you all. But for those that can't visit, you could see examples not only of the images, but you could read his journals through a digital collection. And we also provide public access to the collection. I think these 2 points are what we do best. So preservation and access is what is our main service and what we want to do with our collection materials. This is a view of our reading room. And this was before we opened, and this is brand new. It's not even a month old now. So again, kind of midway through the reading room, there's that window into the gallery. Who uses the Archive of Documentary Arts? I just wanted to highlight a couple different user scenarios to give you an idea of the kinds of people that use our collections. So one, as I mentioned, the general public. Sometimes that's for enrichment or genealogy, for example, or people that are just curious, they have a favorite artist and they want to come in and see actual work by them, or hold that daguerreotype in their hands. But we also have, of course, a wide variety of student and faculty users, mostly from Duke, but we do have international and national visitors that come specifically to use our collections. Independent researchers, historians, curators, and artists. So we're trying to connect with all of these different types of users and really think about the different ways our collections can be used by researchers of all kinds. And I just wanted to address some kind of frequently asked questions about the archive. As I mentioned, we do acquire all types of media formats, so digital and analog, as well as those things like ephemera and records. Most of our collections that are acquired aligned with research interests at Duke and at the Center for Documentary Studies. That's not always the case, of course, but that's kind of our mission to support the work that originates at Duke. But within that, we do kind of broaden those horizons. So while we have a really strong documentary studies program on campus, it's also our job to think about not just the things that people are currently studying, but what might be of interest in the long term, or what's that undiscovered work that fits well with our collections, but maybe no one's seen or heard of yet. Let's see. The ADA accepts less than 10% of the collections it's offered, and this includes offers of full donation. And I just want to mention that because, as Jenny said, in some sense we are inundated. In some ways that's a good thing. We like to know what's out there, but it's also impossible for all of us to accept everything that comes across our desk. And sometimes that's about fit. We want archives that will be used. We don't want things that will sit, in the sense that it'll be used by researchers, and also in the sense that it's not going to sit, in that warehouse and not be able to be processed. So we want things that fit our strengths. Most ADA acquisitions are partial or full donations. The ADA does not originate traveling exhibits and does not publish monographs or catalogs. Now that's not to say that those types of things haven't happened from our collection materials. We actually have a great track record of having faculty and even grad student uses of the material that have led to exhibits and monographs. It's just the library does not have a publishing arm and does not facilitate the actual nuts and bolts of a traveling exhibit. But we work with researchers, whether from Duke or not, who are interested in doing those types of things, and will facilitate making that happen. But more from the perspective of, can and should this material travel? If this is going to be used in a book, we want to make sure that we're providing the most high quality resolution image, and an image that represents the print or material as it should be. So we're facilitating that work, but we're not creating it other than inside inside the Duke community through our gallery space and internal programs. Yeah, so we're part of the Special Collections Library. So if we, kind of the hierarchy is Duke University libraries, then Special Collections. And on kind of another arm is the circulating collection, where you can just go in, browse stacks, and take books away with you. Does that make sense? The Duke Library does not originate travel. No, it does not. The other point I kind of wanted to drive home was the ADA seeks partners, not simply donors. And by that, I mean we don't necessarily, it doesn't work best for the collector, for the institution, or for the materials if kind of your first priority is you want to empty that garage and get it somewhere quick, right? That doesn't serve the materials. We want someone that will work in partnership with us to walk us through the materials. You all have the materials and you know them best, and we can't extract some of that information without you. Even in the best case scenarios of a super organized archive, you all as caretakers will know much more about that from the beginning stages than we will. And without kind of us working together to kind of transfer that information to the library, a lot of the history will be lost. So we want someone that will work with us to talk about the history of the collection, to talk about the description of it, fill in gaps where it's not where information hasn't been left by the artist, and try to do some of that detective work up front before it comes to the library. And those types of interactions are conversations that happen, in some cases, over years. That's not to say we can start a conversation anytime, but often it's a series of conversations going from, okay, I have this big treasure trove in my garage or attic, to me kind of saying, well, I need a list of scope, or I need a little bit more information so that when we can check in again and you can provide more information and we can work together like that. So my final slide here is just a kind of list of bullet points of how we might start a conversation if you felt like your work was a good fit for the Archive of Documentary Arts. And the first bullet point being to determine first if the ADA is the right setting for your collection. And that's easily done through kind of just going to our website. I mean, I'd welcome a visit at any time, of course. And if we got deeper into a conversation, I think that's something you'd probably want to do, just as we'd want to visit and see materials before they come to the library. But if you're not familiar with the ADA at all, the first step would be going to our website, looking at our mission, looking at some of the collections we have and our strengths to see, are there other materials that we already have that relate to what you have, for example? Does this relate to some of the scholarship happening at Duke right now? Do you see connections emerging from what we already have? And if you don't, can you maybe give me information that might help me do some of that dot connecting, right? Just because we might not have images from a certain time or place doesn't mean that we won't take them. It's just a matter of thinking about how they'll be used and if they would be used. The next kind of bullet point is to define the extent of your collection in a basic inventory. And an inventory should include the quantity of materials and media type, just at the very basic stage. As you might get further along, you might want to create that full list that has every single title of every print that you have, for example, and do that long spreadsheet work. But if you're at the very beginning stages, having a basic inventory of the scope and the kinds of materials you have, in some sort of list, some documentation of the condition, or even just some iPhone pictures of where it is, the boxes that it's in, that's a real big help. Determine the condition. So of course, if you're really inventorying your collection, you're going to know intimately the condition of the materials. Are there things that are in danger and that do need immediate attention, or have these things been stored well, and if so, could they be stored better? So kind of knowing that up front and giving me a heads up of whether there's things that are in imminent need of care, and that could be in danger of being lost otherwise. Determine how well your materials are described. So description is really huge, especially for my archive. We're not quite as able to use from a research perspective anonymous images, especially more contemporary work. We want to be able to locate it in history and in place and be able to know something of its context. Determine who can claim ownership over the materials. Is there one heir or multiple heirs? And that's kind of the same issue for copyright as well. If you're a living photographer, that's not to say that you can continue to administer your own copyright if we chose to work together, but that means keeping in touch even more. So it's not a condition to come to the archive that you have to turn over your copyright to us. If you want to continue to administer that, we need your contact information, and we need you to be willing to work with us to approve those uses as they, approve or deny those uses as they come in, and then to assign an heir to the copyright at some point eventually, while it's still in copyright, making sure the contact information is up to date, because what we don't want to have is an orphaned copyright or orphaned material that, for that period from the death of the maker from 75 years after, if we have no one to contact about whether it should be used in a book or not, it just won't be used, right? And finally, determine the expectations for the future of the collection. So I know there's a lot of talk about matchmaking and placement, but maybe even before you think about what's the best place for your archive, maybe think about what are your expectations for how the materials should live in the future. Would they work best in a research context? Would they work best in a museum or a historical society? Or is it something that should stay in your family? Those are all possible outcomes. So what is your expectation, and what is best for the work, I think, is what we're all concerned about most. And I'm just going to end by throwing my contact information up here. I invite you to visit our website and learn a little bit more about us, and do feel free to contact me. But I will say, with some of that inundation, sometimes I have a very slow turnaround time on email. That doesn't mean I've forgotten. It just means that you're in the queue. So please don't be distressed if I don't respond immediately. But I'd really invite, for those that think that the archive might be a good fit, I'd love to start a conversation with you. Thanks.
So I have to apologize. I'm showing my age. I'm going to be relentlessly analog today. Let me sort things out here. I'm George Miles. I'm the curator of the Yale Collection of Western Americana at the Beinecke Library, and I'm greatly honored to be here. I want to reinforce the thanks to Mary, but also I really want to thank all the people who have agreed to come and participate. I had a wonderfully educational day yesterday and again this morning, and so thank you to all of you who are here. I thought I would take up Andy's charge about matchmaking and, in a sense, try to use my experience as a model of a sorts, but to try and make some general points rather than to speak too specifically about Beinecke, although you'll have to bear with me as that's what I know. And I want to reinforce points that I think I've heard from both Jennifer and Lisa about the importance of informed communication if you're looking to make a match with a repository. You want to know and or learn about the institution and the staff at the institution with whom you're approaching or who you might approach. And you need to know and perhaps be open to reevaluating what you have to offer and what your ambitions for that are. Absent thinking about those two themes, it is quite easy to waste an enormous amount of your time and to frustrate people who are well-meaning and well-intentioned at lots of institutions. So let me start by telling you a little bit about me and about the Beinecke in what I hope will be context of other possibilities. I want to talk about what you should understand about the Beinecke that is unusual or distinctive, and perhaps through that help you think a little bit about what you're looking for. So first of all, recognize that the Beinecke is a research library. It's different than MoMA, it's different than the Met, it's different than the Whitney, it's different than the Amon Carter Museum. In some ways, we are different even than the Huntington Library and Art Collections, because as a research library, we are organized topically, not by format of material. I'm curator of Western Americana, not curator of books, not curator of manuscripts, not curator of prints or photographs. I have all those materials as part of my collection, and so in a sense, neither I nor any of my colleagues at Beinecke collect photography. We collect the history and culture of the American West. We collect African American arts and letters. We collect the history of early modern Europe. We collect the history of post-war avant-garde and counterculture in modern Europe. We collect American literature. In that sense, we are very interested in photographs as they relate to those topics and subjects. So for me, from the beginning of my career at Beinecke in 1981, I have always been very interested in the content of images. They matter. If I attempt an analogy to writing, if I think of photography as writing with light, writing works from lyrical poetry, brief, imaginistic language poetry of 8 lines into extensive, wonderful nonfiction that's carefully crafted by great literary artists. Photography can be much the same range. Photography can work from someone simply playing with light to someone who's out trying very much to make a carefully crafted, inspired, and deeply creative record of what they encounter in the world. And we're pretty much on that documentary side, although there are times when I've waffled. That's a major consideration for us. We have, and I have over the last 10 years, become increasingly responsible for our American history collections. But if you look at the Beinecke Library and put us in the context of the major repositories for the history of 18th and 19th century America, Eastern America, let us say, our collections are not nearly as robust or as strong or as full as we are in the West, and our bias probably will continue to be to play to our strength, where we are fortunately endowed to be able to do many different things. At the same time that the content of an image is important to me, I've also come to recognize over my time at Yale how important the history of photography broadly is in the history of American culture, and perhaps nowhere more than in the American West, where the American photographic experience is almost inextricably tied to the expansion of the nation. O'Sullivan, Watkins, Jackson, Russell, they're out there learning how to make photographs, they're exploring the medium, they are developing a vocabulary at the same time that they're out there recording the resources of the country and the way in which it's being built. And in that context, we get interested in how do photographs travel? How do they become part of a cultural conversation? Why are they made? Not only why are they made artistically by a photographer, but how do they make them? What are the constraints of the process on them? What was their patronage? And once made, how do they get out? Are they seen? By whom? Under what circumstances? In what formats? So that broader kind of conversation is something we want to look at. And I think that's particularly germane to the question of contemporary photo archives, because it does mean that I am deeply interested in understanding not just having as part of the collection a fine set of exhibition prints, which are marvelous things and we love to have them, but also deeply interested in being able to understand the work process that produces those negatives, contact sheets, work prints, in a digital age, raw files, unflattened Photoshop or Lightbox files, as well as final prints, whether they're inkjet or in some cases designed to be on a seen as JPEGs or as TIFFs in some kind of viewer. We continue to be interested in what I would call the creative process, the artistic process, understanding what shapes and forms a photographer's understanding of their work, correspondence, diaries or journals that can tell us something about what was going on in a photographer's life or in their mind. I'm not a great practitioner of photography myself, but I have a sense that there are many people who could appreciate and understand a photographer's log. What's the information that a photographer is recording as they shoot that can perhaps, under the right circumstances, be interpreted by a future scholar to better understand the choices a photographer was making about what they were taking. And certainly, we remain interested in what I don't regard as crass, but which is simply the reality of the economic impulses and pressures and constraints that everyone operates under. Business records can be of interest. Sale records are certainly of interest. All of these are things which we imagine feed a research agenda at a library, which can be quite distinct from a museum's interest in building a broadly comprehensive collection of master works. Now, and that's a distinction that I could make 30 years ago with far more certainty than I can today, because more and more museums have begun to develop a research agenda. You will find museums who are willing to collect a photographer's archive in ways that 30 years ago wouldn't have happened. But I think in general, museums tend to remain focused on the broad general public's ability to come in and see work on a wall. They are interested in, and museum professionals are often interested in putting together an exhibition which is the culmination of their own research into some aspect, whether it's a particular photographer or a theme in photography. A research library is really more about bringing students and scholars into the reading room to encounter those materials over time, for them to read other people's mail, as Mary said, or to dig, as Diana described, and to find photographs for a new project. And we reach the general public as a secondary result through the scholarship that those people produce. So think about that as you imagine where you might think your archive might belong. Now, what I need to know about you, or what you need to be able to tell any curator, whether in a museum or in a library, I need to know what you have. Now, I want to suggest cautiously that that doesn't mean you have to have an item level inventory. It does not mean that you have to become your own archivist in the same way that our staff at Beinecke or the staff at Duke or the staff at the Huntington will help to organize, arrange, and describe your collection. But you can't come to me and say, I got 200 boxes of stuff. So I reinforce what Jenny and Lisa have already said and what you've heard previously. It is important for you to be able to assess the kinds of things that you're looking to place. I have roughly 1,000 exhibition prints. I have negatives and contact sheets from 20 years worth of work that might roughly be 50,000 images. I'm just making up numbers. I have work prints that I did for maybe 3 times as many exhibition prints as I finally produced. I didn't keep my correspondence or my business records. I kind of, once I did my tax return, I threw them out. Or I have all my correspondence with various galleries. I have projects I did with this publisher or that publisher. I have early drafts of the book I produced here, of the text I did here. It shows my revision process. That kind of broad categorization you want to do. That's going to help a great deal, and some sense of quantity. Now, as you heard yesterday, depending on where negotiations go, you may need to get more granular than that. If you're going to make a donation, if it's not your personal papers and there's a tax deduction potential in the archive you're representing or working with, you're going to need a lot more detail than I just suggested. And you're going to want to turn to professional appraisers to help you with that. But you don't have to do that work before you can have an intelligent conversation with somebody to sound out in general terms, are you interested in a more detailed discussion? At some point for me, when I have that detailed discussion of any sizable collection, I need to be able to come see it. So you do need to think a little bit about it being in some kind of presentable form. Now, that can mean I go to a storage locker in the Hamptons, and we find a way to look at it. Or I end up at an advertising agency in Cambridge, which has an air-conditioned room where a lot of material is stored. Or it can be I'm in somebody's living room, and they've spent a couple of days before I arrive setting things up so that I can look at material. Again, at that stage, I'm not seeking to see every single piece. It's not practical. But I'm going to want to be able to look at that a little bit. So give yourself some thoughts there. But equally important to being able to tell me what you have is for you to have some idea before we begin talking about what you want. be honest. Is receiving a payment for this archive essential to you? Don't try and hook somebody with a vague conversation about, you know, I really want this to be preserved. It's really important to me that it be available. And then know, eventually you're going to say, and I want $1 million for it. If you want $1 million for it, be forthright about that. It will save you time, it will save me time, and it will keep our relationship quite friendly, even if I don't have $1 million or I don't agree with you that it's worth $1 million. But we can, it's a starting point, and honesty and frankness, in my opinion, is one of the key parts of an informed communication. So don't try to seduce librarians that way. It really, it won't work. It goes backwards. But aside from that question of is it a sale, is it a donation? If it's a sale, how flexible you are. There are a whole host of considerations which we've heard discussed over the last 2 days that you want to think about fairly seriously. What are you willing to have done or not done with your negatives, or with the negatives in the collection? Will you let somebody else print them or not? Will you let somebody scan them, reverse polarity, and put them up on the web? What do you think about work prints? Will you let me exhibit them, or are you going to say, I only want them looked at in the reading room. I never want those things to be shown because that's not how I print it. Okay, but yes, you can look at them in the reading room. Are there some prints in the collection you're willing to allow to be reproduced but not exhibited? Because you have a feeling that by the time this is reproduced, even in the best technologies, they get muddied down anyway, and the minor imperfections that keep me from calling this an exhibition print don't matter. But if somebody were looking at this in an exhibit case, they'd immediately see what I don't want them to. These are real considerations for artists. I've come to appreciate these over time. And you want to be thinking about those. If you're working with me, I'm probably going to prod you on some of these questions, but the more you think about them in advance, probably the better off you are with a conversation. What do you want to do about intellectual property? What are you willing to do about intellectual property? For me, one of the great challenges in collecting contemporary photography, and one I continue to deal with, is my concern about whether or not the limited funds that I might expend in purchasing this work can or cannot be productive for scholars down the road. When I buy an literary manuscript collection, if I'm acquiring correspondence, fair use and scholarly practice are pretty clear that I don't really need to obtain for Yale or for later scholars your copyright. Fair use practice, I can do brief quotes from your correspondence. From a long letter, I could probably quote even an entire paragraph in an article or a book, and you will not successfully sue me for copyright infringement, okay? And in fact, I'm not really, if I'm a scholar, I'm not reducing your value in that. I may even be enhancing it. But photography is a little trickier to me. And I don't understand fair use. I'm not going to say I do, but how do I write about a photograph, if I'm a scholar or a student, without showing the photograph? Or how do I meaningfully talk about this without being able to reproduce it? But I'm reproducing the entire original work. That's one of the things that weighs against a fair use. I am commenting and I'm criticizing it. That weighs towards fair use. If I'm only using one photograph by you and a big book with lots and lots of other work, That's probably fair use, but suppose I'm trying to do the scholarly study of Lee Friedlander. I'm probably not going to want to do 1 or 2 photographs, even if I'm not trying to do a Lee Friedlander monograph. So that question does come up, and I really wrestle with it. And I've been very fortunate in the most part to be able to reach agreements, arrangements with immediate photographers that leave me very comfortable in the short run. But the copyright laws in this country now mean your copyright persists, goes to your heirs and assigns for 70 years after you pass. I thought it was 70, but I thought 75 was work for hire or something. I have to go back and look. I could be wrong. The 5 years there hardly matter. The point is that for most photographers, there are at least 2 generations after you who are going to inherit those rights. Well, you can, but do you want to or not? And under what terms? And so the question was, can't you just assign your copyright? You can, but do you want to? That's one of the things you need to think about, and do need to recognize that in the context of someone for whom putting the image on the wall is not the main purpose, the ability to use that image in scholarly communication and interaction becomes a real factor. So I suggest you think there. And as both Lisa and I think Jenny have spoken about, what's your desire or interest, commitment, ambition for publication or for exhibit? And what can the institution do? So just as Lisa spoke, the Beinecke Library does its own exhibits, but we don't generate traveling exhibits. We are willing to help and support a traveling exhibit, but we're not willing to be the backbone of that. Somebody couldn't come to us and say, we want to exhibit your collection of David Plowden on the road. We want that material available for scholarship and study, 100 images going out to 3 sites over the course of a year and a half. No, we might be inclined if someone came and said, we're putting that exhibit together, you have the best prints of these 3 key photos that we think are really important in the show, we're likely to say yes. We'll find a way to make that happen. But if you are hoping for a grand exhibit, the best I can do is a show in New Haven, and I can't promise you that it'll happen quickly because I get to do one exhibit about every 3 or 4 years. And I've got the entire history of the American West that I want to cover over time. And the same way, we would collaborate with a book publisher, but we don't have, the Beinecke itself does not publish books. So you want to think about those matters. Within that, if you've got that list of ideas in mind, it's a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation and to explore possibilities. Be aware that one of the great challenges that I think all museum and library collections are facing with photography is that there is an amazing amount of good work out there to be preserved, particularly in a field like mine, in which I may be almost as interested in the unknown amateur photographer who's technically competent, who is visiting parts of the West that are underdocumented, as I am in the most famous American photographer who's making spectacular images, some of which are in the West. And so I see in a year, generally, my biggest challenge is not finding things to add to the collection, it's agonizing about what I can't add. And in that context, I'd encourage you to be broad in thinking about where you might go, to recognize that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of repositories throughout the country that might provide highly reliable service to keep your materials safe and accessible for use by future generations. They may not have the resources to provide you market value for a purchase. They may not have the resources to produce the monograph that you really wish could be done for your father's work. They may not be able to do that great exhibit that it absolutely merits, but they may well be able to make sure that 50, 75, 100 years from now, a graduate student or an independent photo curator finds that collection and discovers it and republicizes it and brings it back into the cultural conversation about what photography meant at the turn of the 20th and 21st centuries. Thanks for your time.
Okay. So we're going to have some Q&A now. Oh, good. Here, your notes, maybe.
Thanks.
One of the things you brought up about limiting use is I was able to allow the university to got my prints to any use that they wanted for editorial, for exhibits, publication, internal use and research. And that solved the problem. I still kept the copyright and I still kept outside third-party usage. And it seemed to solve the problem. I don't mind my stuff being photographed and shown and put on the internet.
Yeah, as part of our course of dealing with contemporary artists and estates, we have a one-page non-exclusive licensing agreement, which basically allows the Huntington to use the work in the context of our mission, which is education and research, so that every time we put it in a brochure on the web, we don't have to come back to the artist or the estate or the heirs. And that seems to be a pretty common thing. And we also can negotiate that if necessary. So that kind of covers us in that regard.
Duke has a similar arrangement that will tailor with individual artists if there's particular things that they may or may not want to approve ahead of time or not.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask my two partners, do either of you think that that right extends to granting permission to scholars for scholarly publication, or do you refer everyone back to the photographer for those kinds of uses?
I mean, the hope is that this is something that the Huntington will then take on for the artist or the estate. But in very rare cases, we tailor it because the artist or the estate wants to handle every single request. And then usually what ends up happening is after a few years of that, they come back to us and say, actually, we really don't want to handle every single request. So it really is a benefit to both parties, I think.
I would add here, from my own point of view of working in this project, that the most frequently thing I find among photographers is that they overvalue the value of their copyrights. There's not much value to most photographers' copyrights. The actual use, the $5 a year that you might get, or the $10 a year that you might get for publishing something, is kind of to extrapolate that into tens of thousands of dollars for most photographers is an absurd proposition.
I think
My own feeling too on that is that any revenue generated from the copyrights should go to support the collection. This, again, it gets back to the intent. What do you want to do? How do you want your collection to be supported? How do you want it? Should it be self-supporting? Should it try to support itself as much as it can?
I might just add to that, though, and something we talked about in the book breakout group yesterday is I think there's inherent value in reproduction and scholarly use, but it's not necessarily about monetization. I think there's a high value in images being used in publications, and I think sometimes that value outweighs the $10 or $15 or $100 that you might get from it, not to discount that, but there is also the inherent value of the material being used, which can also help build that legacy.
I wanted to ask if any of your collections, or if you know of collections that deacquisition works, and can you put that in the contract that you wouldn't want them deacquisitioned, or what would happen in 100 years or 75 years?
I think that's a really important question to ask going into any relationship with an institution, is what their deaccession policy. In the Huntington's case, and my colleagues can speak, we have had a very strong policy of not deaccessioning anything we've brought into the institution, which means we do a lot of upfront prep work, before we take in an entire archive. That said, in recent years, for various reasons, we usually do work out a situation where we'll work out with the donor. If we bring in a collection, it's very clear that things that we don't want or we don't feel are useful to our research agenda will either give back to the donor, or it will be a situation where they'll allow us to sell it or dispose of it in any way we see fit. So that's a great question and something that everyone should be thinking about.
That policy is true at Duke as well.
Very similar at Yale.
Are there indexes or catalogs where if you had a topical collection, which is what I have, that you could find which institutions pursue that topic?
That is a great question. There's not sort of one-stop shopping, I would say, for that. I think that one way to go, so one organization that I would really highly recommend to this group is the Society of American Archivists. They have a very strong visual materials group. They have lots of members from all over the country. I mean, this is more, we're talking more archives and historical societies and research institutions. But they have lists and guides and members for the institutions that collect photography and other visual materials around the country. That would be one place I would go. And you know, unfortunately, it's sort of institution by institution. So it's sort of asking around too, and just kind of getting a sense from if there's one specific topic is very strong, start talking to your other collector friends, dealers know a lot of where they're placing material.
One of the consequences of the web has been almost the death of any kind of printed guides to libraries. A Google search strategy can probably point you to some. You'll have to refine it. But most repositories are using the web to try and describe themselves. And you know, the first strategy may get you 1,000 results and you throw your hands up, but there can be ways to do that. But I want to reinforce a comment that Jennifer just made, where I'd had a scribbled side note and forgot to include it in my earlier comment. I want to encourage people who are dealing with an archive to look to third-party experts. We had a long conversation yesterday, a useful conversation from the appraiser's point of view. But in addition to appraisers, there is an established rare book manuscript photography trade in this country. The photography trade may tend to be historical. Andy Smith has dealt probably more with 19th century photographs than he has with 20th. But Andy is very familiar with institutions as a consequence of that, and he's not unfamiliar with what is entailed in an archive. Howard Greenberg is here. There are a variety of people that you can turn to for advice From my perspective, one of the challenges of negotiating directly with a family member or even directly with a photographer at times is the fear that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, a descendant is going to say, Yale took advantage of my father. They knew it was worth more than they gave him. You know, so I am, from a fiduciary point of view, I need to represent Yale. I can't represent your best interests and Yale. I can try to, and I can try to be frank, but ultimately, whoever's coming to us, they do need to have some expert opinion. So unless you're really sure of everything you want, unless you're confident you don't need somebody in your corner, I would encourage you to consider seeking some expert advice, and that can really help with the question of where do I go from here.
Follow-up question, what kinds of people, you said gallerists, what are the other kinds of people that you would consider expert advice? Like scholars, gallerists, I mean, what are the broad categories?
So I would say that scholars are not normally where I would send you for advice about a transaction. They may be
Content only.
yeah, they'll be helpful. They can be very helpful on the sense of perhaps where they've done similar work, you know, where they've done their research. In that context, if for scholarship, often you can hit their bibliographies and you don't have to find them. They'll leave their tracks for you pretty well that way. I think generally speaking, scholars are naive about how things get into libraries. That's been my experience. But in the photography world, gallerists are certainly a resource. The challenge can be that gallerists, generally speaking, are selling a single image or small groups of images into the retail market. They often are going to help you position a portfolio or a small suite of images for a museum sale. I can't think that I've actually worked with anyone I would call a gallerist on an archival acquisition for Beinecke.
Yeah, I mean, maybe Andy has something to say to this,
Well-
but there's some, I mean, on the West Coast anyway, there are some dealers that also serve as brokers. It's in the dealer realm.
But I would think that to me is one of the functions that APAG
Yeah.
can address, and if we can communicate better and start setting up some mutual databases where we share information and share it, I think it's the outgrowth of organizations like this where we're going to get our best advice.
And if I could add, as a primary source, you guys are librarians, is that right?
I'm a curator.
So on your pages on your library's
Yeah.
website, you could list the topics, the subjects that you curate.
Well, we do that. So that would be, I mean,
Is that
that's,
also done at an institutional level?
yeah, yes, at an institutional level. I mean, that's, I think George mentioned that you should go to the websites would be a first place to go for sure.
Great.
All right, I knew I was going to get in trouble before I get out of here. Look, there's something wrong with this whole paradigm because there's a lot of people, such as myself, you know, who get left all kinds of things, stamp collections, coin collections, all kinds of garbage that we don't know what to do with. And if we do not have our lives to do this. I think there needs to be a total separation here. Never mind, you know, I also take a history of anthropology course. It's in the anthropology department. Can you imagine, we all find some dinosaurs. We got a whole bunch of bones. We got to sit here for 1,000,000 years figuring out where to put them. And then where do we put them? We don't put them in the bone museum. We put them with the, you know, the teeth and the this and the that. It's like schools. We had schools before that had 5,000 kids in it. Didn't work. We split it all up. We got little places for this, that, and the other thing. We need a new paradigm. We're going to be here year after year, and we're going to be told that they don't want this and they don't want that, and we don't know what to do with this and we don't know what to do with that. We need a different paradigm. We have a whole bunch of storage problems, okay? And these storage problems just need to be organized in certain ways, and they could be all over the whole nation. And when we have a material object here that is dying off, all right? There's going to be no more photographs. I have found, as I go into my younger courses, I go back to my university, and I have to, you know, I listen to everything, so forth also, And then when I bring out real photographs, you know, all the young people are very interested. They haven't even seen them. They haven't even seen a negative. So I think, I don't have the answer, but I know that the questions are not right. We need to rethink this. We may not have the answer today, we may not have it next year or the next year, but I know that this is going to go in a different direction pretty soon. These don't belong with the books and the this and the this and the that. You can have a few in the institutions, and you can send them down the street to some other spot to go do this, where you don't have to put them in such expensive places, like universities or so forth and so on.
But what you're asking here for, you're
I'm
talking
asking
about
us-
two things here. You're talking
Everything,
about
more
real
than two.
estate. You're talking
Yes.
about real estate.
Yes.
So real estate is a big issue in
Right.
storage.
Right.
It's a big issue for every museum.
Right.
It's a big issue for everybody who stores an archive.
Right, and even
And-
personnel, like in the schools, they've switched it around so that you only need a certain number of teachers certified in certain subjects, but you don't necessarily need the shop teacher or the this teacher, you know what I mean? You could have helpers in these buildings and along with scholars somewhere.
But to have real estate, you have to have huge sums of money.
Depends where you
And-
want the real
no,
estate.
No, it doesn't depend. If you want to store your material properly, you have to, yourself, you have to build your own archival storage unit. You have to humidify it.
Well, we
You
can't
have
do
to
it
keep it all
individually.
fixed. If you can't do this,
We can't do
this
it
is why
individually.
you're looking at other institutions to do this for you perpetually. This is why this model actually works. We don't need a new paradigm. What we need to do is focus and get better about our distribution system and our communication with each other. And that's going to allow us to move forward in a wonderful way.
But
But it's
they
not
tell
saying
us-
we have to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to
It's
reinvent
not,
the wheel.
the wheel, we're not on the wheels anymore. We're off of the wheel.
We don't need to reinvent it. So.
Could I just add something just to slightly redirect the conversation? I think so far we've been mostly talking about issues of too much stuff and where it should go, like a proliferation of prints and materials. And just to kind of jump into the future a little bit, that won't always be the problem. We're going to come to a moment very soon where we don't have stuff. In fact, our problem will be that we don't have enough stuff. So I just kind of want to insert that into the conversation for those of you that are working now, the importance of printing things out, of creating a contact sheet yourself, even if you're not using film, right? Create a digital contact sheet in Photoshop or work prints that you print out and simply write things on the back of your work prints. You know, that doesn't address your problem, but that's how photography has always worked. I know that doesn't answer your question, but I just want to mention that the next generation of problems will be a lack of documentation in things.
I wanted to ask a question for George. Many people in this room fondly remember Peter Palmquist, and I was lucky enough to go to college in the same town and met him as an undergrad, and was stunned to walk into his home and see basically a museum archive. And, you know, before he was, you know, killed by a hit-and-run driver, I know that the Beinecke acquired a lot of his collection. And I thought, could you talk about the role of that, of, you know, like somebody like Peter in rescuing work and then bringing it to an institution like you?
In that case, that's a case where Peter and I hammered out that agreement ourselves. Peter knew what he wanted. He had a pretty good appreciation of what we could offer. And perhaps we were both naive, but we
Can you
reached
tell
an
who
agreement.
Peter Palmquist was for those? There may not. Maybe
So,
not.
so Peter Palmquist was the staff photographer for Humboldt State University in Arcata, California. He'd grown up in Northern California and had taken up photography as a kid. He would say years later he was astonished that he hadn't blown his parents' house up because he had his darkroom in the attic. He went off into the Army after high school, where he continued to ply his trade as a photographer at Supreme Allied Headquarters in Brussels. He did all the the daily photography for the intelligence briefs that, flew over nightly to Washington in the days before the internet. Went back to school afterwards on the GI Bill and became a professional photographer. He did weddings. He did shoots for the local magazines and newspapers. Somewhere in the midst of that, he wandered into an antique shop. Actually, he told me he went to an antique shop because he was courting a young lady, and she wanted to go antiquing, so he said, okay. He was more interested in her than in the antique shop. In that antique shop, the owner said to Peter, what do you collect? He said, well, I don't collect anything. She said, well, what do you do? He said, I'm a photographer. She said, look at these, and she pulled out a bunch of 19th century carte de visites. Peter had never seen these. He had no idea what they were. He began to realize that his profession had a history, and from that moment forward, he became one of the most passionate collectors of the social and cultural history of photography in America that we've ever seen. His 2-volume magnum opus is a biographical directory of American photographers of the Daguerrean era. Anyone who took a photograph in America before 1860, Peter wanted to know everything he could possibly know about that person. He wanted to find every such person who worked in America, and he wanted to then know their entire careers. He collected, he studied, he built research files. He, at some point, got the same passion about women in photography, and an unpublished project, which sits in boxes at Yale now, was an attempt to do a biographical directory of women in photography internationally. Peter, over time, built an extraordinary collection in Arcata. He had about a half-acre or a three-quarter-acre lot on which he had a nice house. He devoted his entire downstairs, turning it into a library and a studio and a study place. He had photocopy machines for various purposes. As he ran out of space in that building, he constructed outbuildings around this little lot devoted solely to holding his collection. He was an extraordinarily organized man, and the indices and the records he built were just incredible. And he built a fabulous collection of 19th century, and even in the case of women photographers, 20th century photographic collections. He was passionate about collecting Carlton Watkins, but he often would find expensive Watkins items and sell them to Andy or to other dealers in order to be able to buy more general stuff so that he could represent the work of more people. One of his great pieces of work was one of the early Carlton Watkins retrospectives, which he did in coordination with the Amon Carter Museum and Martha Sandweiss, who was then curator of photographs at Amon Carter. But Peter was less interested in the high aesthetic market than in the social cultural history. Much of what I know about American photography and my approach to American photography is simply because Peter walked into the Beinecke Library a year and a half after I had gotten started there as a wet behind the ears curator, and asked me, what did I have by Carlton Watkins? And I happened to kind of know what I had. But Peter said, what do you know about this? And I said, I don't know anything. And it turned out that was the smartest thing I ever said to Peter, because he had gotten tired of being looked down upon by curators and museum specialists, that he didn't have his credentials. And so Peter and I had, I'm sorry for going on like this, but Peter's a very special person in my career. And so after about a decade of talking back and forth, Peter began looking for a home for the collection. And our interest at that time, heavily in 19th century and the broad cultural and social history of photography, the practice of photography was a great fit. So we have a wonderful collection now. Almost all of Peter's collection is now fully cataloged and described online. You can find it on the Yale website and through our catalog. We're working on his personal papers. I don't think his personal photographs or personal papers are yet up on the web. But it's a classic case there where in one fell swoop we were able to dramatically increase the scope of what our collection was, and we got beyond simply being the great famous photographers of the American West, into the point that I could do an exhibit from Peter's women's collection 5 years ago. I could show work from 32 different women photographers operating in the state of Iowa in the 2 decades after the American Civil War. Who knew there were that many women photographers in the country, much less in Iowa? That's the kind of thing Peter's collection made possible. I don't know if I answered your question, and I've hijacked the session. I apologize.
So we're going to take a break now for lunch, and we'll have our breakout session later.
We'll be here for the breakout session.
These guys will be here for the breakout session. We are going to kick off the next talk at 2:15 instead of 2 o'clock, so you have a good hour for lunch.